presented by Vyasa Media Network.
Melissa, you're a human rights expert. You've held so many senior global leadership positions, a UN special mandate holder. Let's go back to the beginning. Where and, how did you grow up and what inspired you to become a lawyer?
Sure. Well, I was born in England. I spent my childhood there. And after that, I spent just as many years in India, also in Nepal, because I lived in Darjeeling district and came to Nepal very often. My mom's side of the family is entirely based in Nepal. And after that, I went to the United States, and I've lived there for 24 years now. Yeah. So in that sense, I feel like I'm a global citizen. I've grown up in so many different places and been influenced by many different cultures and also at very different stages of my life, which I think also has made a difference. What ultimately made me want to go into the field of law, in part it was, I think, a result of not wanting to be a doctor.
Your father was a doctor.
My father, yes. Yeah. He is a doctor. He's retired now. Yeah. And you know how it is, right? There's always, well, even if a parent is not a doctor, there's kind of that in our culture, right?
Also back then, I think it was even more, right? Very prestigious and great to be a doctor.
Exactly. Parents wanted their kids to be doctors because that was a statement in itself, right? Of, being intelligent and smart. And so a matter of great pride for the parents as well. And in my case, because my dad was a doctor, it was almost like, well, of course she should become a doctor because her dad's a doctor. And so, she should as well as the eldest child. But eventually what happened is I ended up choosing a profession that was very, in a way, new to my family. I'm the first lawyer. When I really think about it, I'm the first lawyer on my dad's side of the family for sure. Maybe even my mom's. My mom has a huge extended family, so I'm not entirely sure. But my dad's side for sure. So in that sense, I did break new ground. I did something very unexpected, something very new. But actually, my best friend from 6th grade, who's still a very close friend of mine, her dad was a lawyer. He's no more. And it's funny that I ended up choosing the profession of my best friend's father versus my own dad. But what really, I think, sort of nudged me in that direction was at some point, my dad actually subscribed to this magazine for me. He signed up for a subscription. It was called Social Legal News and Views, which was kind of interesting because with his whole medical background and focus on medicine and his desire to see me become a doctor, I guess once he realized that my heart wasn't in that and that he should help me, maybe he wanted to help me consider other options. And also because, in a sense, I guess I was raised in a bubble. I have a younger sister, and she and I grew up very protected, very shielded. We don't have a brother, and my parents always treated us, like, I guess, how people treated their sons back then. There were always very high expectations that we would focus on education, we would become professionals, we would become independent. And maybe he wanted to help me broaden my own horizons. So this magazine started arriving sort of once a month, and it really focused on social justice issues and the role of the law in addressing these issues, or sometimes how the law itself was problematic and the root cause of many issues. And it sort of opened up a whole new world to me because I had grown up so shielded. Frankly speaking, I think I was very ignorant about a lot of things that were happening around me. Because, you can grow up in a society and just not really fully comprehend.
Yeah. You still don't know a lot
the issues and the problems, because they're not your problems, right? Or even when you sort of hear about certain things, you may not, just fully understand the gravity of those situations and how those are not just individual problems, but somehow they're systemic. They're connected to systemic issues, broader issues. So anyways, reading that magazine once a month, and it was actually presented in a very simple manner. It wasn't a heavy academic journal. It was more written in a very simple style that conveyed the issues. It actually had little illustrations as well. And that just made, that sparked something in me. Like I felt like I discovered a completely new interest, and that really helped me decide that I wanted to pursue law.
And, law is such a big, diverse field. I mean, it's law, but it's also so much more than law. Did you very early on decide that, women's rights, advocacy, human rights, this was something that was your area of interest? Or at that point, it was just law, and then, let me be a lawyer. I will figure out whether, I'm interested in civil or corporate or things like that.
It was very basic at that stage.
Yeah.
It was more, I think, just an interest in understanding the role of law and also the appeal of it being an actual profession. Although back in the day, there was this very common notion that, if you can't do anything else, you end up becoming a lawyer. Or
really?
All lawyers are liars. Those were like common phrases. Or, people who are not that smart end up becoming lawyers. Because the choices were doctor, engineer, lawyer.
Yeah,
right?
Very limited choices.
Yeah, very limited choices. The ones that were encouraged, right, were very limited. So I can't say I had a very clear vision of exactly what kind of lawyer I wanted to be, but I had a very deep interest in just the use of the law and how it connected to different kinds of issues, social issues. So I guess the social justice dimension of it is what really drew me into the law. But no, in the beginning, I didn't know which area I would focus on. I honestly didn't know that much about the law. I knew what the subjects were that would ultimately be taught, like criminal law, civil law, contracts, stuff like that. But no, I didn't know the rest.
How was it in your early days? You became a lawyer in the 90s. At that time, Nepal was... I'm not sure if it still is, but at that point it was a very male-dominated society in a lot of space, and specifically law, right? I think we were talking about it. Supreme Court was all men most of the time as well, right? Like you would probably be meeting at any given space or time more male lawyers than women lawyers. How was it working as a female lawyer then? What were some of the challenges?
There were some specific challenges in my case because I went to law school in India and I came to Nepal, and this is where I started working for the first time ever. What brought me to Nepal was actually marriage. Right? I got married to someone in my final year of law school. Again, I wasn't expecting to get married in my final year of law school, but it was an arranged marriage. It just turned out that way. And then I moved to Nepal and started working here. So one challenge for me was just also figuring out the legal landscape in Nepal and, where I fit in this context where I didn't have a law degree from Nepal. I hadn't studied Nepalese law. And for me, just that itself was a huge challenge. And then slowly I realized, okay, there are many different things you can do with a law degree, right? You can be a litigator, or you can be an academic, or you can maybe be more involved in policy, advocacy. So all these possibilities started becoming quite apparent to me. And I felt that I had to try out a few different things before I could make a decision. So I took up a position as a volunteer at the Legal Aid and Consultancy Center.
LAC. It still exists.
It
right?
still exists. And it was founded by this lady, a feminist lawyer who I think in some ways was kind of ahead of her time back then. Dr. Shanta Thapalia, a very warm woman. She basically took me in, and she was very kind, and she really supported my learning and introduced me to all the things that were happening at LAC, all the different opportunities. I never felt like I was, that I had to limit myself in any way. Actually, she really encouraged me to expose myself to all the policy discussions that were happening in LAC at the time relating to the property law in Nepal, which was discriminatory, and there had been a whole case challenging the constitutionality of Nepal's discriminatory property law, and there were discussions around policy reform. She allowed me to accompany lawyers at LAC who actually provided counseling to victims of domestic violence, and that was the first time I ever met women who had experienced domestic violence. And I found myself in a role where I had to be part of that sort of process of providing support. And as I was learning, I was also supporting these women and helping them. And I also did a lot of legal research. and writing as well, which was then used in different ways by LAC. So I was given all of these amazing opportunities, which to me at that time, like everything was of incredible value because I felt like a student all over again. So I did that at LAC and in a very supportive environment. I also participated in a young lawyers training program.
Okay.
I don't know if LAC still does that, but back then, and I think this was just an incredible opportunity for me, but for young lawyers in general who had just graduated from law school, because it really exposed them to the practical side of the law. Basically, it was a very well structured and designed program where senior lawyers would come and talk about different types of roles in the legal field and what they did. So, we had activists, we had litigators, the Attorney General, we had people from different walks of life within the legal sphere who came and talked about their work, basically educated us about different aspects, practical aspects of the law. There was a field component. So I remember going away actually for a couple of nights to, I think it was an area somewhere around Chitwan, where we spent time and worked at a very local level, spent a few days sort of engaging with women at the grassroots level, and then sort of came back. So there was that very holistic legal training, which was funded by GTZ at the time. So I hope they still fund this kind of program, was also an incredible learning experience, and I think really deepened my interest in the legal advocacy and policy side of things, and also the movement side of things. And then after that, I did work at a law firm for some time, kind of as an apprentice, just to learn, to get exposed to how law firms operate in Nepal and the litigation side of things. Through that, I was able to also go to the Supreme Court. I accompanied a senior lawyer to court to observe how they argued cases. So that was a very interesting experience. And that's actually when I felt like I realized that the legal field, at least at that time, was very male-dominated. And personally, that for me was a big turnoff, because it made it very difficult for me to see where I could fit in and how I could fit in. And I knew that I didn't want to be in a role where I kind of felt somehow limited and constrained. I wanted to be in a role where I felt, energized and free to learn and free to do things. And so it didn't seem like the right fit for me. And then the other factor, which is a bit more personal, that also affected my thinking at the time was so my husband's grandfather, he was a Supreme Court justice. So that's a very prestigious thing. I say that with pride. And my father-in-law also has a law degree. So my husband's side of the family has a number of lawyers and a whole
Except
history.
your husband.
Except my husband, yes. He's in finance.
Yeah.
And so on the one hand, whenever I went to court, people somehow figured out, because of my last name, Upreti, that, they quickly figured out the connection, and they'd be very respectful and very nice. Say, such and such go natini buari or buari. And that felt good because I was also new to Kathmandu. I was newly married. So that kind of recognition, I felt that was kind of a positive thing at the time. But then it also made me wonder how I would carve out my own identity in a context where
you're constantly overshadowed.
And in Nepal generally anyways, I don't know if they do that nowadays, but back then the first question would be, kosko chori wa,
I was going to say, our generation doesn't do it anymore.
No.
When we are talking to someone else, we're seeing the person for the individual they are. But when we meet people from the elder generation, right?
Yeah.
Mostly if I meet any sort of, let's say, uncles or aunties or, the civil society, they will ask, whose daughter are you?
Exactly.
Who's your mother? Who's your father? Who's, buari? So that is where the conversation still is there with that generation. And I'm assuming it was so much more then.
Yeah. So 30 years ago, that's what it was like. And so there's a positive side to it because in a way it helps you fit in.
Yeah.
But then there's this other side to it. And in my case, because I aspired to be a professional in this field, it left me wondering when, if ever, I would carve out a name for myself, like what my own identity would be.
And also, I feel like sometimes in cases like this, the others around you, your peers, might, you might be actually working really hard and putting in all the hours and all the effort. But people also judge you that you're just there because you come from a place of privilege, and you might actually not really deserve it.
Yeah.
And it might not be the case. You might be working really hard for it, but then that just gets completely overshadowed by the fact that because of your family, you're actually just there as, using your privilege.
It's so true. So it's really because of all of those things that then I felt like I would rather be in the world of policy and advocacy and part of, sort of do work that related more directly to women's rights and systemic reform and change versus, being a litigator in a court.
Yeah.
Even in the, even if it was the Supreme Court of Nepal, I just felt like, okay, this was not for me. But then all of this other stuff, this other world was definitely where I wanted to be. And then in the meantime, I became pregnant, and it was my first pregnancy. So I really wanted to take it easy and enjoy it. And in a way, that became a priority, although I did continue to volunteer for a while. Towards the end, I decided, okay, I'm going to, have my baby. I'm going to take some time off, and I'm just going to focus on my new role as a mother. And that's what I did for several months after I had my daughter, my older one. And then around 5 or 6 months, when she was 5 or 6 months old, I think, this is when my sister-in-law's friend showed up, who was also a very close friend of the family. And I called her Didi and knew her really well. And she was always very nice. She showed up one day and she said, okay, there's this opening at the Asia Foundation and you have to apply for it. And I said to her, look, I have a baby in my lap,
Yeah, I have a 6-month-old baby.
A 6-month-old baby. I barely sleep at night. Yeah. I don't really know what I'm doing. I don't have time to think about work right now. Maybe down the road, but not right now. And she said, no, you have to apply. This is, this would be perfect for you. And they're really looking for someone. And you match the profile. So she convinced me to apply, which I did. And they called me in for an interview. So I interviewed for the position after not having slept the whole night because my daughter was sick. And it happens with little babies. They're fine one day, sick the next. You barely get to sleep at night when they're that young. So when I went for the interview, honestly, I was kind of like a zombie. But during the interview, there were 5 or 6 people who interviewed me. But during the interview, in spite of not having slept at night and not having sort of planned to, even try to get back into the workforce, or to find a place, because this is, again, a very new kind of role. It would have, for me, but it wasn't something that I'd already thought about. I realized during the interview that I really enjoyed talking about these issues and responding to their questions. So it was a fairly long interview, and then after that, they told me that, they would let me know soon. At the end of an interview, you always ask what the next steps are. So they told me they'd let me know soon. And I left the interview, and honestly, they let me know almost right away. I mean, they offered me the position. They were looking for someone. Clearly, they needed someone right away. And I ended up taking the position. And it was for the role of a program officer at the Asia Foundation with a focus on women's empowerment. Yeah. So it was perfect for me in a way. Yeah. And I spent about 1.5 years at the Asia Foundation and learned a lot in that role as well, because I was given incredible responsibilities and I had colleagues who were also really good, from whom I was able to learn a lot as well. But the main focus, one of the big projects I worked on, the main project I worked on, required me to study Nepali law and then to develop a curriculum that was geared towards advocacy. So the whole idea was to basically translate the law presented in very simple terms. So legal provisions relating to women, women's status and women's rights. To translate all of that into sort of very simple terms, but then to frame everything in a way, to present things in a way that it motivated them to advocate for legal reform. So it was a very action-oriented, advocacy-oriented curriculum. But through that process, I learned so much because, like I said earlier, I didn't go to law school in Nepal. I studied in India. So that's where I learned about the law.
I was going to say, and that's what I want to ask you now. You know, a lot of people now still go to law schools in India and then come back. For people, or even abroad. I was just talking to someone this morning, you know, I was doing my research. She went to Cambridge and she came back. I know you've not spent the last couple of years in Nepal. You spent early in your career, but because you still worked here, if someone wants to work in Nepal, wants to work as a lawyer, would you still recommend today that, you know, it's better for them they study law here locally and then continue? Or actually, you know, India, some great law schools or abroad, and they can always come back and then take the test here. Just as a career, what would you recommend? And I understand it's personal, just your personal opinion. So
I believe, and based on what I've seen, because I have seen a lot of individuals and women succeed as lawyers with law degrees from outside Nepal who have come to Nepal and taken up jobs and doing really well. So I don't think one should look at that as an impediment. I think it's absolutely possible. It really is a personal choice. I think if someone wants to study in Nepal from the get-go and then eventually get a more specialized law degree from overseas, that's absolutely fine. If for whatever reason a person wants to study abroad and then come to Nepal and work here, they will have some catching up to do, of course.
And they have to take the Nepali bar exam.
And they have to take the bar exam if they want to be a certain type of lawyer, like a litigator, or they want to, you know, practice law here, certain types, in certain areas. It's a necessity, it's a must, it's a requirement. They would have to do it. But I think it really boils down to the individual and how they want to do it.
Yeah, and one of the things you mentioned, you started doing a lot of research in women's law in Nepal. So I just want to go back to that, right? What was the, you know, when we're looking at women's rights in the late 90s, early 2000s, what was the situation then when we're talking about property law? In terms of property law, I would still like to know what is the rule now as well? Like, how did it change and what it is now? But, you know, even abortion law and things, what was happening then, and then, you know, what changed and what's happening today now?
Well, in the 90s, the laws on the books were very, very discriminatory. And after the transition from a monarchy to a democracy, with the introduction of a new constitution and a new legal framework, I think that led to new aspirations and a new way of looking at the law. So cases were filed in court challenging the constitutionality of certain provisions in the National Civil Code, claiming that they were discriminatory. So it's in the 90s, actually, that then, you know, these challenges were brought. It became clear that what we had on the books were not good laws. So there was that recognition, and litigation really laid the foundation for this movement that followed, that led to the amendment of the National Civil Code, where several discriminatory provisions were amended. And that included the ban on abortion, the criminal ban on abortion, as well as the discriminatory property laws. Interestingly, I feel like the whole discussion around abortion was overshadowed by the discussion around property.
Yeah, people probably cared about that more.
People were very preoccupied with that.
What was it then? So at that point, women didn't have rights to family property?
Daughters did not have an equal right to ancestral property.
Okay.
Sons had the right upon birth, like once they were born, they basically had a right, whereas girls did not. There were certain requirements. So they would have to be 35 years of age and unmarried in order to be able to inherit ancestral property. If they got married after that, they would have to return it. So it was blatantly discriminatory. And that was challenged in the Supreme Court on the basis of the new constitution. And the court found it to be discriminatory and asked the legislature to amend the law. But not just that law, because the case that was brought at the time was also informed by research that identified more than 100 provisions in the National Code as discriminatory. The Forum for Women, Law and Development is the organization that conducted this research. So their whole legal strategy was also based on solid research and analysis and solid legal arguments. So what the court said to the legislature was basically, the case itself was filed and it challenged the discriminatory property law, but the court recognized that there were many discriminatory provisions in the Muluki Ain and asked the legislature to take appropriate steps to address the discrimination that existed in the law. And that mandate then basically became the basis for the women's rights movement in the late 90s, early 2000s. Women mobilized, so women working on property rights, abortion, child marriage. There were discriminatory penal provisions for rape, a whole range of things. They basically started mobilizing and engaging and working together and organized around a common purpose, which was to amend the national
penal code,
the Muluki Ain, so basically the national code.
Yeah. So what is it now? Just for women who are seeing or observing and who don't know, right? Like I'm just thinking, I might be educated and running my business and everything, but I still don't know much about the law. So just as a female, if you just look at basic property rights, what is it today?
Yeah, there was
at the very basic.
Yeah, at the most basic level, now it is more equal.
Yeah.
There is a right, but in practice, it's very difficult to implement. So in practice, and this is the challenge with the law, you can have a good law on the books that's not discriminatory, but when it comes to implementation, you may not see the outcomes that you would expect from that kind of law because there are other factors that come into play.
Social factors.
Even back then, when the advocacy was happening, there was a lot of discussion around, people expressed concern about, or even said, okay, even if the law does guarantee equal rights, women were cited as saying, well, we will want to preserve our family relationships. Maiti sang relationship preserve rather than taking property. So this is the challenge, right? So now we have a law that is more equal, but a lot of
what does it say now?
Individuals.
Like, what does the law say now in terms of property?
Honestly, I really don't know.
Okay.
As of today, because there have been multiple amendments, over time. So I don't want to misstate the law.
Right.
But
the whole crux is, even if there is, a lot of people don't actually use it because of all the social situations around, right? And in terms of what their priorities are.
Yeah, and there's also a bit of a debate. It's and I'm not taking sides in this debate when I refer to it, but the idea that, okay, if daughters do inherit, well, they're going to benefit from the husband's inheritance. So why should they? Or why on earth would they also expect to receive anything from their parents' side? So, there's this whole discourse that kind of also then puts women in a position that suggests that they could be kind of double dipping on both sides. So I haven't myself done, any studies or looked very closely at to what extent these provisions are being implemented. And there have been so many different amendments along the road.
I'm sure over the years,
So I don't want to misstate the law now. But what happened then was itself a massive leap forward. But in practice, it has not necessarily
been implemented.
And
if we talk about abortion law, like back then, because I remember talking to you and you mentioned that people actually went to prison for abortion. So a little bit more on what was the situation then, and I understand there might be more amendments now, but what was the big break that happened and how things changed after that?
Yeah.
Just a little bit more light forward. Because a lot of people, who've not studied law, back in 2000, we were young kids. We were there. It's not something that was before our generation, but it did exist, right? So just what was the situation then? And I think you were also co-petitioner in the Lakshmi versus Nepal case. So just a little bit more about that.
Yes, abortion.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so the starting point for us, and this was when I was really just starting out in, and learning things, was that there was a general prohibition on abortion, so a criminal ban, and very specific penalties for having an abortion. And there was a very vague exception in the law. So this was all in the criminal code.
Yeah.
And there's an exception that was so vague, कुनै महिलाको उपकारको लागि केही गर्दाखेरि abortion भयो भने that would be legally acceptable. But in practice, it was so difficult to define upakar and what that really meant. On the one hand, that vagueness created the possibility for women to have abortions clandestinely and for providers to perform abortions without being punished. So there were many women who did actually have abortions in Nepal. Many of them traveled overseas or went to India across the border. We have an open border. They would go and they would come back. But when abortions are done clandestinely, they are inevitably unsafe, right? And it's very risky. And then because of the prohibition, and not just that, but the criminal penalties, at that time, 20% of women who were in prison were there on charges of abortion, or even worse, on charges of infanticide, which carried a life sentence, because the lines between abortion and infanticide were often blurred in practice.
And it's up to whoever wants to prove whatever, right?
Exactly.
Like someone might have actually had a miscarriage and it could be proved as infanticide.
Yes, no distinction was made. And actually, it was so common for women to have spontaneous miscarriages because if you looked at the cases back then, almost all, I would say without exception, women who were in prison, women and young girls who were in prison, were from rural Nepal. I mean, these were women who had to work in the fields, did not have the luxury of being able to rest during pregnancy. Like, I would hear so many stories of women just giving birth in the fields while they were still working, or just suffering a miscarriage and losing a pregnancy altogether, even wanted pregnancies. And this was so common, but when this criminal provision was implemented, that kind of distinction was not made at all. And in fact, because abortion generally carries quite a bit of stigma, we saw a kind of viciousness towards women who had abortions or who allegedly had abortions or who were suspected of having abortions, because those women, especially if they were adolescent girls, they were always viewed as having transgressed certain norms, social norms, expectations. The assumption was, oh, this woman did something bad, or this young girl got pregnant outside of marriage, shouldn't have been pregnant in the first place, should have been having sex, got pregnant, and then tried to cover it up. The normal presumption of innocence that typically applies in criminal cases did not apply in abortion cases. We found that when we documented how the law was being implemented at the time, because that was also something that I did later. So, the standards of due process were not applied. And this really compounded the injustice and the unfairness of the provisions on abortion. And Nepal at the time was one of the very few countries in the world where women were routinely imprisoned for abortion or were doing, serving long sentences. The other thing that we saw was that the sentencing was very arbitrary. So depending on the judge, a woman could get 2 years, or someone else would get 5 years, and another one would get 10 years. Just really, it was very subjective. And we know that gender stereotyping is pervasive in the judiciary and all of our systems, really. Like, we live in a very patriarchal society. All of our systems are fundamentally patriarchal. And so women who suffered miscarriages or who actually had induced abortions because they had an unplanned pregnancy just never had a chance of getting a fair trial.
Right.
I mean, they shouldn't have been prosecuted in the first place. So that was very common in Nepal. And so what happened is, the property law, the discriminatory property law was challenged. The forum had done a broad study, and I had identified the criminal ban on abortion as also being discriminatory, which is also very interesting because in a lot of countries, the right to abortion or abortion restrictions back then, even now to some extent, are not necessarily viewed as discrimination against women or as being discriminatory. So this framing that was used in Nepal, I think also really helped.
In the region, I guess, too.
In the region, but also, like, for example, in the United States, abortion is viewed has been framed as a privacy right.
Okay.
Right? Roe v. Wade recognized it more on grounds of privacy, not as
discriminatory against women.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think the foundation of our amended abortion law, which recognized it more as a form of discrimination, that was the main argument that was used by advocates at the time, was actually an excellent argument and contributed to the success of the whole process of law reform. And but the evidence of women being in prison and how they were denied due process, that evidence really helped. There was also research done by other organizations that really showed that it was low-income women or poor women, rural women who were already disadvantaged and faced so many barriers to access to justice, who ended up being in prison. So there was a clear, it was also an issue of class discrimination. There was also the issue of, it was in some ways there were economic dimensions to it as well. Yeah. So ultimately, the arguments that were used by advocates were really a combination of all of these different types of arguments, and these arguments became part of the broader advocacy agenda, which ultimately was successful in 2002 when the National Code was amended. Yeah. So what happened then basically was that abortion became legal on several grounds. So Nepal kind of
flipped completely.
Yes. Yeah. From being a country with a very restrictive abortion law and a record of, with a record of women routinely being imprisoned for abortions, to a country with a very liberal abortion law. But the catch was that there was still language in there that said that abortion was generally prohibited. So, and it remained in the criminal law part of the National Code. Then? Yes. So there's still stigma.
Yeah.
And there are actually still cases of women and girls being imprisoned because the moment one has an abortion outside the legal framework, they are prosecuted if they're caught. So there are still cases, but I would say the biggest achievement back then for advocates and for women and for girls was that, yes, it went from being almost completely criminalized to being legal on several grounds. And then that laid the basis for really the Ministry of Health and other entities in Nepal to start providing safe abortion services. Right. And that took a few years. It took about 4 years for the government to introduce a protocol to actually implement the amended provisions, but it did happen. What we found was that for several years, though, there was still a very low level of awareness of the legal amendments. A lot of women and adolescent girls did not know that it was not completely illegal anymore, that they could actually seek abortions if they needed them. Services were limited, though. And so we came across this case that involved a woman called Lakshmi Dikta. She already had several children, and she became pregnant. I think it was for the 6th time, and she did not want to continue the pregnancy.
I mean, it was a 6th child.
Yes, exactly. And this was a woman, who was, who didn't really have the means to support another child. And she and her husband both agreed that the pregnancy should be terminated. They went to a hospital to get an abortion, and she was denied the service because she couldn't pay for it. So she was forced to continue the pregnancy and give birth to another child. And this is the case. Lakshmi became, she was at the center of this case that we brought. And the case was filed, I was one of the co-petitioners because I was involved in the development of the case.
Yeah.
This was when I was at the Center for Reproductive Rights.
Yeah.
We had been working with the Forum for Women Law and Development to try and identify opportunities to use strategic litigation to advance reproductive rights in Nepal, to establish and advance reproductive rights. And this opportunity arose, and we took it, and we filed this case. In strategic litigation or public interest litigation, typically you don't seek remedies for individuals. It's more about systemic reform. It's about challenging.
Overall, changing the law.
Changing the law, changing the system. Yes, so this was one of the main objectives, really the main objective of the case, and we were successful. And we got a decision from the Supreme Court where basically the court upheld the right to abortion as a constitutionally protected right, because by that time, we also had an interim constitution that recognized reproductive rights as
basic rights
constitutional
for women.
rights. Yes, as basic rights for women. So the timing was
Everything
also
coming
very
together.
good. Yeah, a number of things came together. Of course, how we ended up with an interim constitution, the whole story of developing the case. I mean, these are
complete stories in themselves. They're full stories in themselves, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think the most important thing was that the court gave us the mandate to then, well, first of all, recognize that this woman's right, constitutional right to have an abortion had been violated. And it's issued an order basically instructing the legislature or the government, other branches of government, to introduce a comprehensive law.
Yeah.
So that became the foundation for really the Safe Motherhood Bill that we have today, that covers a whole range of reproductive health issues in a human rights-based way. And in that sense, it was a great
So
success.
in simple language today, if there is, someone who has an unwanted pregnancy, they can go get an abortion and won't be penalized for it.
They can legally seek an abortion. Yes.
Right.
There are still certain time limits, like 12 weeks, 18 weeks, certain conditions, etc. But they can definitely seek an abortion in much better conditions with greater legal protection than women could 30 years ago. And I would say with less stigma now. Because that's the other important thing. When something is legal, it sort of also helps destigmatize. And we still have...
It takes over time to do it.
It takes a while. And, we could do more. We could do better as a society, I think, to destigmatize abortion. So could the government. But at least now, women don't have to die. Because that was the other thing. The maternal mortality rate was also very high at the time in the late 90s. And one of the major contributors to maternal mortality was unsafe abortion.
Yeah. So in my limited knowledge, and please just if I'm wrong anywhere, you said that in Nepal it became more about discriminatory laws, whereas in the US it's about privacy. In US it still comes up as to, abortion is not completely legal in certain states or things like that. Why is that happening? Just your personal thoughts, right? You would think that the world has moved so far ahead. It's a female's basic rights to whether have a child or not, right? And then there are still, people who think that, I don't know if it's religion or what is the reason that it is wrong to have an abortion and it's still made illegal.
Well, the United States has a federal system of government, so we have now, especially with the fall of Roe, because there's no constitutional protection, a constitutional right was taken away. I mean, that itself is, it's pretty astounding that even happened. Not wholly unexpected. It was predicted by many, but the fact that the court took away a constitutional right is hugely problematic. The United States has now a patchwork of laws. So states have the authority to decide and make laws relating to abortion.
They're people,
health issues and abortion. So now that's how we've ended up with a patchwork, because there isn't one federal law that protects the right across the board. And in the United States, again, this is one could talk about this for hours, but the very simple answer to this is a lot of opposition to abortion is really ideological. It's driven by ideology because abortion is so politicized in the United States. It has been used as a political issue. It's being used as a political football. It continues. It's something we've been seeing for decades. Mm-hmm. And it just really is a very powerful case study, I think, which really illustrates what happens when you have, when an issue is politicized. You see these consequences where legal protections are, first of all, you don't have the legal protections that you need. Politics has superseded the law, basically. And it's a very challenging situation.
Okay. Yeah. Moving back to your career from, abortion law and everything, you decided to go to grad school in the U.S., right? You went to Columbia Law. You mentioned that there was a talk by Lynn Friedman that changed your career. Just wanted to talk about it. What happened, or what did you hear during the talk that had such a profound impact on you?
Yeah, so Lynn Friedman is an expert, a reproductive health expert who also has a background in law. So I went to her talk. It was one of those typical lunchtime events where, again, in college, in school, you kind of attend these events for free lunch, for pizza, whatever. Yeah. But also because that's the only time when you can really fit something in like this. So I went to listen to what she had to say. The topic was maternal mortality. And I was just blown away by how she combined these different perspectives of public health and law. And she talked about maternal mortality from these two perspectives. So in a way, for me, that was the first time that I heard someone very sensibly, very logically explain why maternal health is not just a public health concern, but it's also a legal issue. You see, having grown up in South Asia, having heard about maternal deaths and maternal mortality, I also just looked at it as a health issue. And more than that, honestly, for example, my mom's sister also passed away a few weeks after giving birth. This was years ago. So I had heard her story from time to time and always thought of it, as something that very sad and that had happened in the family, something very tragic. It never occurred to me that might have been preventable. It never occurred to me that there might have been some systemic causes behind that, like lack of access to healthcare, the lack of health infrastructure, the unavailability of clinics or the inaccessibility of clinics, or the lack of culturally appropriate healthcare, physical inaccessibility, information inaccessibility, or just the lack of decision-making power on the part of the individual. And these are the things that Lynn Friedman sort of talked about, because these are all elements of the international standards that are applicable to the right to health. You look at these criteria. When you talk about the right to health, so a health issue from a legal standpoint, what are you looking at? You're looking at whether the health service is available, accessible, affordable, provided in an acceptable manner. In terms of accessibility, you look at information accessibility, physical accessibility, and quality of care. The way she laid out these elements just made such sense. And to me, I felt like I had discovered that this issue actually had a legal dimension. So something just clicked in my mind. I thought, okay, this is what I want to do. Like, I want to be talking about issues the way Lynn Friedman talks about issues and addressing these issues in the same way. So that multidisciplinary, I think, aspect to how she talked about, the way in which she explained the issue really caught my attention, and opened up a whole new world to me. And that's really what then, because, I guess the other thing is, when I was at the Asia Foundation, I worked in the Women's Empowerment Program, but I had colleagues who focused on reproductive health. So we would often have conversations, like we'd be in our respective cubicles and we'd just be talking across the walls about different topics. And I think a lot of things sort of came together for me in that moment. I started remembering those conversations and then the abortion advocacy that I had done in Nepal and what I had seen and heard, the role of, public health experts, how they had talked about the issue, the Family Planning Association issue, how they talked about all of these things. And I just decided that this is the field that I wanted to be in, because reproductive rights is not, I didn't take a course in reproductive rights because reproductive rights was not taught as a subject.
You probably didn't have a course
school.
then.
No, there wasn't a course. So, it was really just but when I heard Lynn Friedman, I felt like, okay, this is how I want to understand this issue,
right,
and approach this issue.
So, and after this, you got an internship in this space, which then translated into becoming a job. How was it? And then, since then, you have been working like in international organizations from, moving from Nepal, working. I know you were in the advocacy space. Even here, I think the Asia program was still like a global organization based out here in Nepal.
The Center for Reproductive Rights?
No, not Center.
Oh, the Asia Foundation?
Yeah, the Asia Foundation.
Asia Foundation was more national focused.
More national
Nepal
focused, yeah. So
it didn't have a global.
You moved from national focus to more international or regional focused, from working in a local organization to international organization, which then, moved into even bigger international organizations. How was that for you, like working? And then, when you said, I think you started working for the Center for Reproductive Rights and you also started the program in Nepal, right, in this region. That's like essentially, as we say, like entrepreneurs, like starting a startup here, like a complete new space for you. How was that experience?
It was an amazing experience overall. I guess now looking back, because when you're in the midst of it, sometimes you don't even know where you're going. You don't know. Sometimes you don't know what you're doing exactly and where you're going to end up. And the field of reproductive rights at that time really was evolving. Like I said, it's not a subject that I studied in law school. Everything I know about reproductive rights is really, I've learned by doing and by working with people who were innovating and experimenting, bringing new legal arguments. When I started working in this field, maternal mortality was not fully recognized or rather the way we framed it later was the right to survive pregnancy and childbirth was not already fully recognized as a human right. People recognized the occurrence of maternal mortality and how that was a public health problem, but no one had really approached it from a human rights and a legal perspective, like fully at that point. So this is an example of an issue that progressed from becoming a major public health issue to slowly becoming recognized as a human rights concern. So this is the kind of work that I ended up getting involved in when I joined the Center for Reproductive Rights, or the Center for Reproductive Law and Policy at the time. I grew with the field. So even on the issue of abortion and abortion rights, all these different dimensions of abortion. And in Nepal, I had the most unique opportunity, I think, to work on the issue of abortion because of how it played out in Nepal, because of the criminal ban, the imprisonment of women, and all these basic civil and political rights violations that were taking place, denial of due process, and also looking at abortion as a health issue, but then also having the opportunity to really analyze it as an issue of denial of autonomy, individual autonomy, and the human rights implications of that. So the way, I guess, my learning progressed was from, domestic advocacy to international advocacy. And within that, at the same time, just really the evolution of these issues and the growing recognition that these were also legal issues. And then what that meant in practice was we sort of drove the discourse in many ways through our strategies. We did legal advocacy and used creative arguments. For example, on the issue of abortion, I remember the Center for Reproductive Law and Policy, or the Center for Reproductive Rights, as it's known as today, led the argument that denial of abortion can constitute cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. Like this assertion was made in the case of an adolescent girl who was forced to continue a pregnancy where her fetus had been already diagnosed as an encephalic fetus. So the brain was not developing, and yet she was denied a therapeutic abortion. She was forced to give birth, knowing when everyone knew fully well that this child born from the pregnancy would not survive. So it's in that case that this argument was made that constituted cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, and the Human Rights Committee recognized that argument, accepted that argument. So it's through this kind of creative lawyering as well that, that was part of the progression. And so I feel like I grew on so many levels, in so many ways, but yes, learned a lot by doing and really sort of doing work that led to the development of standards and jurisprudence, which then through advocacy, I was able to see implemented at the national level.
Right. And you're also building your team in this region, right? Because,
yes,
I remember you mentioning that when you got, then they were like, we have a position here for this. How was that experience?
Yes.
Because it was probably I don't know, but, I felt like very early on, there's not just advocacy work, right? But then there is also, choosing the right partners to work with in the region.
Yes.
Having all the core people there. How was that experience?
Yeah. So when I applied for a position at the Center for Reproductive Law and Policy, it was actually an internship position. Yeah. So I remember, right before you graduate, you obviously need to find a job or you want to find an opportunity that will allow you to get some practical work experience. So I still remember going through this massive binder. So this is more than 25 years ago. And flipping through the pages to try and see what I could apply for, whether I could find something that would be a good fit. And then I discovered this opportunity at the Center for Reproductive Law and Policy for an internship in an area that I knew that I was very interested in. So I applied for the internship. And then I got a call saying, asking me if I would be interested in applying for a more permanent position as the attorney for Asia. Like they didn't have a full-blown program, but they wanted to hire someone who could actually then, develop a program. So I interviewed for that and I got the job. And my very first assignment, I was given two assignments. One was to document the human rights impact of the criminal ban on abortion in Nepal. And the second was to lead a couple of regional studies in Asia that looked at reproductive health and women's legal status. So there were these two multi-country publications that I had to lead the development of, for which I had to identify partners in the region. So I made a trip to the region, and that was no easy feat, because back then there weren't really organizations on the ground who were specifically working on reproductive rights. They were not so easily identifiable as they may be today. Back then, there were mostly reproductive health organizations that have been working on these issues, but more from a health perspective, and were involved in service provision. There were legal advocacy organizations and women's rights organizations, but they hadn't really been focusing on reproductive rights because it wasn't an established body of law. So I had to go around and, just meet a lot of people and talk to people and really figure out who we could partner with to do this kind of work that we were trying to do that was new and on a regional scale, and would basically be a learning experience for everyone.
Right. How did you know that, this? Because I think a lot of time there might be organizations that might just be bluffing and, might just want the job and things like that, right? And then it's up to you to be able to choose the right partner where y'all can get work done and, get good work done. Then, that call, is it like gut, or I don't know, that decision making when it comes, right? Like what's worked for you with that I think, on a decision making level?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of informed decision making and then taking a risk as well. Because like I said, there weren't organizations that were already doing this work. And so it really involved talking to a lot of people, taking this idea to also see who'd be willing to collaborate on something like this. But identifying organizations based on their reputations as well. Just, familiarity with the issue. So just finding organizations that were likely to be interested and would probably want to collaborate, who generally had a good reputation. But then, yes, there was definitely an element of risk because it was really hard to know who would actually follow through and deliver. And I have to admit, some of the partnerships fell through. So it was very important when that happened to immediately come up with a plan B. So I think that's the key. Oftentimes you go into a situation, you can't predict how everything's going to happen. Part of it is a leap of faith. Of course, you have certain criteria, but you do take certain risks, but you must always have a plan B because we couldn't allow these massive regional projects to suffer just because someone did not perform. And for me personally, it was also challenging because it was my first time doing something like this, right? So, it was not easy. But again, it was a learning experience and a number of very strong partnerships did emerge. Some, just ended with the life of the project, but there were certain partnerships that actually went on to be very strong as well.
And you spent 16 years in this organization and then, then decided to move on. For me, it's very interesting because, now it's very hard, at least with the state of things in Nepal, is if you can just get someone to work with you for 2 years, 5 years, that's great, right? 16 years in one organization. And then when you move on and move to another organization on day one, how is that experience for you? Because you've really grown and it's like a lifetime in a way of working with one company, right? One organization. And then you move to another one. And it's like, in its way, even if you're in a senior position, it's also starting from the scratch again in another organization. How was that for you?
Absolutely. I think in my case, 16 years at the Center for Reproductive Rights kind of flew by, I think, because it was such a rich experience, a combination of, again, that's where I started out. I still remember a colleague, there's this colleague of mine who left a few years before I did, and at her farewell party, she said, "This is where I grew up."
Yeah.
In that moment, I didn't realize, I guess, the true meaning of that until a few years later. It was my time to give a farewell speech. And I also felt like, this is where I grew up. In a way, I spent 16 years in an organization that also grew massively. I opened an office in Nepal. Before I left. That was part of the organization's growth. But then, of course, I grew with that experience as well. I built a whole team. I managed a global team. I had colleagues in different parts of Asia as well as the United States. But I think it's because it was a combination of so many different experiences, both intellectually in terms of the law and the technical expertise that I was able to develop, and also in terms of management and also operational, opening an office in another country and being part of that process was also something that I derived a lot of, just new perspectives from as well. And so I left and then I took a break for a bit because I felt like I needed to pause because during those 16 years, working at the center was not the only thing I did. I raised 2 kids. The work itself involved an immense amount of traveling and, just really, there were days when I would get up in the morning and just ask myself, okay, where am I today? And that continues even until today because I do travel a lot for work. So after taking a break, starting out in a new organization, in some ways, yes, it did feel very new. But I am the kind of person, I thrive when I feel like I'm able to learn new things. So I went in with that kind of mindset. Okay. I knew what I knew, but then I also knew that there were things I was going to learn at this new organization, the organization that I joined after the Center for Reproductive Rights. It's was known as the Center for Women's Global Leadership, which had a very different kind of history. It had been around for 30 years and had played a key role in the global feminist movement, had been very active in UN spaces, and really contributed to I would say, a more feminist understanding of international human rights law. And for me, moving from the Center for Reproductive Rights, which was an international organization that obviously focused on sexual and reproductive health and using the power of the law to advance reproductive rights, moving to a hardcore feminist organization that worked on a range of issues. Actually, the Center for Women's Global Leadership did not focus on reproductive rights per se. The main issues that the center was known for included gender-based violence. It actually started the Global 16 Days campaign more than 30 years ago. It was known for its work on macroeconomic policy, labor, the work it did with human rights defenders around the world. And there was a lot of new learning. But what was so fascinating was that the multidisciplinary approach and the feminist legal analysis that the organization adhered to and implemented in its work was all new. So because I love learning new things, for me it was just fascinating. Another opportunity for growth. That's how I looked at it when I joined.
And during this time, when you were working here, you also became a UN Special Procedures mandate holder.
Yes.
You were the chair. You were also one of the chairs of the UN Working Group for Women Discrimination Against Women. When that happened, right? When that opportunity came along, I don't know if someone called you or if it was over email or what, right? But I would imagine, for working and, holding such a position, getting this, right, for human rights lawyer, like UN is the place where they want to be, right? And where something like this is offered, that there's hardly anyone from Nepal. Kind of makes you feel in a way that you've made it. Right? How was it when you got that opportunity? What did that make you feel? And then how was the experience then?
Well, that opportunity, so being a UN Special Procedures mandate holder or an independent expert who basically advises the Human Rights Council on issues of human rights. I mean, for any human rights lawyer, it's like the ultimate sort of prestigious sort of opportunity. Right. It was for me, it wasn't something that I had planned to pursue at any point in my life, really, until someone told me, hey, there's an opening, why don't you apply for it? Because in order to be a mandate holder, you have to apply for the position and you have to compete with a lot of other incredible people.
All over the globe.
All over the globe. People are appointed, an individual in a working group, there is regional representation. So I applied from Asia. So I was competing with other people from the Asia region. But frankly, and this is where, for me, it was really interesting, I think, this whole experience. One interesting aspect, again, it's a bit more personal, was that, I've never really had a mentor, but I have worked with incredible people. And I have ended up, I guess, when you work in a particular field for a long time, you do sort of end up being in a role where you mentor others. Yeah. So it was people that I had worked with and mentored who actually nudged me in this direction and said, hey, here's this opportunity. We think you'd be great. And I was like, wait a minute, what is this? And, that's when I started looking into it, thinking about it. And I applied for the position. This is unlike, positions with treaty monitoring bodies. You don't have a government campaign for you. This is a different kind of process. It really is more, I would say, in a way, it's more on your individual sort of merit, experience, and your qualifications. That's what they look at. And then they interview applicants. There's a consultative group which is comprised of diplomats, missions, permanent missions in Geneva. So they interview candidates. They create a short list. First of all, they shortlist the candidates. Then the ones who are shortlisted are interviewed. And then they come up with a short list of 3 from the region, and the president of the Human Rights Council makes the final selection. That's how it works with mandate holders. So I applied for the position. I ended up at the top of the short list. The president usually appoints the person who is at the top of the short list, but until it's done, you're never really sure. And to be very honest, with my sort of background in reproductive rights, my history of work on abortion rights, I really wasn't sure that I would be appointed. And yet I was. So that, to me, just personally and just generally was absolutely incredible. But then that's when the responsibility sort of, you know, began. And this was for 6 years. The initial appointment is for 3 years, and then it can be renewed for another 3 years. And that was a 24/7 job. The thing was, since I'm I believe I'm the first woman from Nepal to be appointed, you know, to have ever had this role. There wasn't anyone else I could talk to sort of find out
ask about how do you go about it, or I'm having these questions.
Yeah. So I kind of went into it not, I guess, fully understanding what it would require in terms of, you know, just time commitment and what kind of a role it would be. But when you're part of a working group, there are 5 other people there who are also new. So again, I was once again in a situation where I was doing something new, incredibly challenging, but also with others. So kind of working as a group, as a collective, quickly learning as I did the work, but also, you know, quickly picking things up as well as I went along.
Yeah.
So
I wanted to ask you, you know, in light of everything that's going on, and you know, with the UN, they work a lot on, you know, maybe some of the rural things, but also in a bigger picture, on a whole level, right? How relevant it is today in the context of Nepal, like, you know, with the stuff that say UN is doing or the UN working groups are doing for Nepal, because so much of it still happens, and then you're just wondering, is things actually being done? Is it still relevant? Or, you know, when you're just looking at things in Palestine happening, right? Like the UN is there, Palestine is there, the world is there, but things are still happening everywhere. So, like, what's the relevancy there today? You know, maybe back then it was, but was just wondering.
Yeah, I mean, the UN is a massive entity, and I think, you know, you have the technical agencies, which people are very familiar with, and then the reality is that the UN is basically, it's an intergovernmental body as well within that. So the Human Rights Council, for example, is an intergovernmental body. And I think the state of politics within the UN, or what may manifest as the UN doing well or not doing well, failing, is really a reflection of governments. The UN does well when governments are able to work together and cooperate and adhere to the commitments that they have under international law. And the UN does not do well when governments do not cooperate and when governments fail to prevent terrible things from happening, when politics supersedes other things. And so what we're seeing today, or what we have seen in different situations over time, I think is often a reflection of that. Because the UN itself it's not separate from the governments that comprise the UN, basically. So I think in this equation, what's really important is accountability. And that's where the UN has, its mere existence is also very important, because that's the one space where when terrible things happen, people can still go, or governments, member states can still go and at least try to seek accountability or to prevent
someone to
certain
voice
things
it
from
out
happening.
to.
Exactly. It's a platform, it's a space, But how it ends up getting used or not, or if it's misused or abused, is more a reflection really of the members in this larger multilateral system. So as for its relevance to Nepal, I would say, well, the Human Rights Council is actually the space where international law is made, norms are developed. There's a lot of focus on implementation. There are debates, discussions, resolutions. There are all these processes that happen within the Human Rights Council, of which special procedures is also a part. Actually, UN special procedures is supposed to be an independent voice. When mandate holders do their work, they are also expected in a way to be critical of the UN. They're allowed to be critical of the UN. And that's exactly why UN special procedures are so important in this whole equation. Special procedures advise governments, special procedures engage in many different ways to hold them accountable, but they also are very important for holding the UN accountable. And that has been happening. We don't always hear about it. But yeah, sadly,
it's happening behind the scenes.
Behind the scenes, also publicly. But right now, I think in relation to certain issues, there is such intense politicization that we are seeing the UN stall and falter. But I wouldn't just blame the UN per se. It's really the member states who have failed. Failed, who are failing people, who are also failing each other. Because in a multilateral system, member states are supposed to not only support each other and cooperate with each other, but also to call each other out. Hold each other accountable. And we've seen that weaken significantly.
Yeah. You mentioned as a special mandate holder, you're working with governments. You're also working with, let's say, the head of human rights, the Secretary General, head of states. Was there any point in your career where you're just like, when you had to be out there working with them, where you're either doubting yourself or you're having an imposter syndrome as to what am I doing, or do I deserve to be here with all these people? And if you did, how did you overcome it? Like, what is it that you talk yourself through? Because I'm sure you are there in all these rooms, right, with very senior people.
Absolutely, yes. And that was one of the most thrilling aspects, I think, of the work. Because unless you put yourself in these situations, you don't ever really become comfortable. Yeah. And of course, when you're at the table with, the Secretary General or the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and you're talking about human rights, and you are sort of representing an entire constituency, and your job is to advocate, to influence their decision making. You do. There are moments when you wonder if you're making total sense. What
are they thinking?
Yeah,
of me?
What are they thinking? Is anything that I'm saying new? Or it's
I was going to say, like, a lot of times, right? Do I bring any value? Am I adding anything? Yeah.
Yeah. So it is natural, but I think the key is, you go in fully prepared. Mm-hmm. You do your own homework first. You go in fully prepared. And, you may not be telling them something that they have, don't know at all, but there's incredible value to reinforcing certain things. Because in a world where there's so many different types of human rights violations and so many competing priorities, even competing development priorities, different ways of looking at things, and there are so many actors who are advocating with these leaders and these influencers, you go in there, you prepare, you make your point, and you can immediately gauge through the discussion that follows whether or not you've made sense. So a lot of it is also thinking on the spot and really communicating, responding to their questions, and also sort of, you get to ask them questions too. So you can sort of assess where they stand. So a lot of it sort of happens on the spot as you're engaging with them. But I remember being in meetings, because one of the big priorities of my mandate, of the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, was really to draw the attention of key influencers within the UN system to the backlash against women's rights, and to say this is a very serious issue, and we really need you to recognize this and to pay attention to this. This is not one of several issues that need your attention, but this is a very profound challenge for women's rights more generally. We would like you to speak out on these issues. So going in also with specific asks is very important, I think. And we made it a habit to do that. And we took every opportunity that we could when we spoke with, whether it was the Secretary General or the High Commissioner, or, when I was a mandate holder, we met leaders of all kinds, presidents, government officials, ministers. a lot of high-level people. But going in, I think with clear evidence, with very strong arguments, just really reminding everyone of the obligations under the international legal framework, invoking the core values of human rights as well, because that's a common commitment that everyone has within the UN, but also going in with very strategically, with very specific asks was always key. And those meetings were always good. Yeah, they were always good. Nerve-wracking initially. But then, at some point, I would quickly discover that, we do have common ground. And many of them often would then open up and start talking about their own experiences. And I think honesty is very important because there are also moments when there would be moments when they would say, I didn't realize this at the time, but, this is how I understand it now. And it was always very, in a way, humbling. And it helped, I guess, me with my occasional doubts about myself, whether I was making sense or not, to also hear them sort of talk very honestly about maybe certain things that they didn't know or they weren't aware of. And so, I think that also really, really helps. And a lot of these key influencers, of course, have a public face, but they're also human beings. So we were often able to connect with them on a very human level, and that really helped as well.
Is there any particular stories or incidents you remember where it was a very challenging situation in one of your advocacy's works or anything that comes to your mind?
Advocacy, generally challenging. I think
any stories.
When I was at the Center for Reproductive Law and Policy, so I was in the kitchen one day just making myself a cup of coffee, and then the president of the organization walks in, and she was this very energetic woman who always had these incredible ideas. Often her ideas were, and people always sometimes, they would hear her ideas and go, wait a minute, this is never going to happen. Or like, only Janet could think of this. That was the kind of person she was. But she was very bold and very courageous and innovative. And she came into the kitchen and said, I'm going to sue Bush. Are you with me? Right? Yeah. So this was in relation to the global gag rule.
Yeah.
So, there I am making my coffee. She walks in. She asks me that question. The first thing that crosses my mind is, oh, my God, if I sue Bush, could I be deported? What'll happen to my husband and my daughter? Could my whole family suffer? Like, my mind immediately these questions started popping up. And then I was like, okay, but I can't say no to Janet, right? Yeah. So how do I handle this?
Right.
So within 30 seconds, all of these, questions and concerns crossed my mind. And then I said, yes, of course, right? Because I thought, okay, let me just say yes now and deal with the fallout later on. So that was a moment when I felt like I was called.
Very tricky.
Yeah, very tricky moment. I was called to do something that sounded incredible. But how often do you sue the President of the United States, right?
Did she land up suing the President?
So yes, I joined that case as well. There were a number of us who joined, and we did. But unfortunately, the case got dismissed, but on procedural grounds. The court held that we did not have legal standing to bring the case against the global gag rule because the Center for Reproductive Law and Policy, CRLP, was registered in the United States. And their argument was because we were not directly affected in a country that received foreign funding that had tied to it these restrictions on how it could be used or not, that we did not have the legal standing. We were not a foreign organization. We were a U.S.-based organization. So it was not, dismissed on the merits or anything, but it was dismissed on procedural grounds. But even just that act of suing, it was a fantastic advocacy move. And we had a whole press conference. And because I had done the research on Nepal, the impact of the criminal ban on abortion, I was one of the speakers. And also as someone who was involved in the case as an affiant, I was asked to kind of testify at the press conference. And we had this trainer come in. This was also interesting. The person that they brought in to train us for the press conference to help us prepare. When I walked into Janet's office, I see this middle-aged man wearing cowboy boots and a cowboy hat. He was from somewhere in the South. I think he was from Texas, but he was an expert, right? And it was his job to train people in public speaking. And so, I went through a few sessions with him. I ended up giving my little speech at the press conference, which was not difficult in the sense that so much was happening in Nepal that it was also important to tell that story. So the story was powerful.
Right.
Like I didn't have to do much to make it sound compelling. I was just relaying facts about women, unsafe abortions, the how they were being imprisoned, the injustices, etc. I'd done a whole fact-finding mission. I'd participated, so I had met these women, so I was able to convey. But then afterwards, he wrote me a letter telling me how touched he was by my speech. But then again, I was just the messenger.
Yeah.
But that whole experience, which something that initially, when she first asked me, scared me out of my wits.
Yeah.
I went along. Initially, I don't think I even told my husband that I was going to do this. I was so... Also, then there was this whole, this concern about, oh my God, what's going to happen when people find out in Nepal? Because this was going to be covered in the press. We knew that the filing would be covered. And it was. There was an article. There was actually someone interning at the center at the time who's from Nepal. And he did a piece on it. But I just thought, okay, let me just do this because... in my gut, I thought it's the right thing to do. Yeah. So when you advocate for human rights, there are always these moments when you do have to follow your gut. You do have to take calculated risks. And in this case, there wasn't an unfortunate outcome at all. But that's not always the case, right, for people.
I was going to say the global gag rule is that if an international organization has American funding, they can't speak on certain topics.
Yeah, specifically on abortion, federal funding. So basically the money that comes through, for example, USAID, and Nepal is very donor dependent. Yeah. So, and has always received a lot of funding in the area of reproductive health. So recipients of that money are not permitted
to talk about
abortion specifically, or to provide abortion services. And the global gag rule had such a chilling effect that it was, in a way, it was applied very broadly. So it really silenced organizations. It really interfered with their ability to even advocate against a criminal ban, against a law.
But it doesn't exist anymore, does it?
The global gag rule is a political football in the United States. Every time there's a Democratic president, it's suspended. A Republican comes to office, and then it's brought back, unfortunately. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So another example of how abortion is politicized in the U.S.
You've held various roles throughout your career. Mm-hmm. You said you've had to travel quite a bit, very demanding jobs. Mm-hmm. How have you throughout, maintained a proper, work-life balance, or prioritize your personal life, right? Whether it's with your husband or your kids, as well as all the work and travel. Like, is there anything that you've done that's worked for you that could work for maybe other working women?
Yes.
Because at one point you had 3 jobs. You were just telling me there was the CWGL, UN Special Working Committee, as well as, you got elected by your peers.
To the coordination committee as well. Yeah, there was one moment when...
so that's a lot of work. As well as, in US, I wouldn't imagine the help and support system is not like Nepal. Right, and with the husband, with family, with kids, with everything, there is so much going on. It's a lot on your plate. How did you go, or how do you still go about it, and how do you maintain a work-life balance?
Yeah. It was a lot. I feel like one part of me just looks back at all of it and says, "Oh my God, okay, I survived this. Never again." I think in terms of... So now I'm actually I'm in a very interesting situation right now because I'm actually making a transition back to the region. Mm-hmm. I've made this choice. My husband and I have decided we want to come back. Some of the reasons are personal and then also professional because of this opportunity to work with the ICJ. Travel has always been such a big part of my life. I think for me, individually, like personally, it's been such an integral part of my job. Like, I cannot imagine how I could have done all the things that I've done without traveling, without getting the exposure to the things that I have seen, without engaging with people, really working in different contexts, being taken to different contexts, etc. So in one sense, I didn't really have a choice. In terms of the consequences of that, the impact of all of that, it really is my immediate family. I mean, my husband and my kids, I think, who in a way have paid the price.
Let me rephrase
for all
this.
of my traveling.
Is there such a thing as work-life balance?
It's
because you might enjoy what you're doing. You might enjoy your
Yeah.
work and everything.
It's like walking on a tightrope. It's just a constant challenge,
Yeah.
I would say. Work-life balance, I don't know if that phrase is even the right phrase. Because I don't know how you can really
Do it all.
create a perfect balance
Yeah.
between the two. I think in many ways, work and life, they sort of get merged together. And your work becomes part of your personal life. Your personal life also becomes part of your work. You end up carrying both, and at different moments, one may manifest more than the other. But it does take a toll. It's not easy to do, because with travel, with extensive travel, there's also the physical toll, but then there's that satisfaction of being exposed to so many things and learning. That element of also that recognizing that you can't do the work that you do without traveling. But then I guess as a working mother, yes, there are always moments when you feel like, yeah, have I neglected my children by being away? I think that's really the biggest challenge. And wondering if that has a long-term impact of any kind, and always trying to figure out how do you mitigate that.
Yeah.
Right? So it means you have to adopt additional strategies and try to think of ways to sort of recognize that and make sure that they sort of understand what you're doing. So it's tough. I don't know if there's a balance. It's just, you just do these things. And you try to mitigate any possible harm. But in my case, in a way, overall, I would say it has paid off, just generally speaking, because, I have, my daughters are amazing young women now. They're young adults, and they have told me on many occasions, now that they fully understand the work that I do, that they are proud of me and they're proud of the work that I do. So for me, that's a sign that, okay, there might have been moments when it was really tough for them, but they understand that it was all for, good reason.
Yeah.
So, maybe that is the kind of reward one can expect, perhaps. But yeah, it is tough. It is tough. And I think it's not so much about balance, but it's more about how do you carry many different things together. Yeah.
If you're being honest,
Yeah.
and I want you to be, because we need to see more women who really have achieved but also have had it difficult and things like that, right? What was something that you had to give away in a way, right? Because when you're doing so many things, at certain points you will prioritize certain things, right? There is a give and take in your life also. There are some things which are more important, but some things which you just don't get the time, and maybe you would want it to do it, but you have to be like, no, these two are more important. I'm just going to have to not do this, right? Even if I want to. So what was something that, I'll give you an example, right? It could be that someone really enjoys hanging out with their friends or meeting people or having a social life. But then their work's also very demanding and very long hours. And then, the little bit time you have to prioritize then, do I hang out with my friends or, go out to a coffee shop, which I enjoy, or spend my time with kids, or, do I go for a painting class that I really wanted to, or, spend a time doing something else, right? So you actually might have to choose and prioritize. Was there anything for you that actually, over time with your career, with family, with kids, and with all the additional things you're doing, that you were like, this was something that I had to leave because in the bigger scheme of things, there were other things which were more important. Have you given that a thought ever?
If I had to sacrifice anything,
Yeah. Were there things that you
on
had
the
to
professional
sacrifice
side,
on the personal or professional side because of the other things that you were doing, right? Just because if you have limited time, you have 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
With everything, were there things that you had to sacrifice?
I guess when you're in the midst of things, you probably don't realize it. But
Yeah.
looking back, and I don't know if this is like the kind of answer that you're
Yeah.
looking for, but
No, I'm just a general.
I would say that my husband, my life partner, has played a very important role. Obviously, I could have not done all the things that I have done in my career and, in this field without his support. And if anyone has suffered the consequences, I think, of me pursuing my passion, I got lucky because I was able to pursue my passion as a full-time job,
Yeah.
right? And like you said, there were moments when I was
Yeah.
working at 2 or 3, doing like
Juggling
a double,
everything.
triple load of work on top of everything else. But he's been the one constant person in my life who's supported me in all of this. So without him, I couldn't have done all of this. And so in a way, the trade-off has been whatever he may have missed out on, perhaps, because of my
Taking more load
deep
at times or
involvement
sharing,
in my work. Yeah. So there are many different ways in which, that I guess has probably played out. But the life part, my spouse is probably the one who has, in a way, paid the biggest price. But, we're celebrating our 30th anniversary next year. So we're still married.
Congratulations on that.
So that's why, actually, a few years ago, so this is how maybe one way in which people can make things work. Just recognizing that when one person in a relationship has a career that's demanding in certain ways, I mean, the other person has to be ready, or there is a reality, right, for the other person. But then I've taken a couple of breaks during my career. I've had that opportunity. So I feel now, for example, that my husband should take a break.
Yeah.
So I am fine, sort of, I'm working full time now. I would be very happy if he decided to take a break from work for a while and just
Take it slow and enjoy his time.
Yeah. So I think that's important. And maybe that's how you create some kind of balance, just so that what you have gained, you also be ready to sort of give to the other person in return when the time comes, or, you make that happen.
Yeah.
So I think that's very important because, when you're actually doing the work, you have to make certain decisions, choices, and things play out in a certain way. But you can very consciously pause and say, okay, now maybe it's the other person's
Time to
turn
do it,
and
or-
time to do certain things.
Yeah.
So working that out, I think, is really important.
That's very beautifully put. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, when I was looking at your career and connecting the dots, I realized there are a lot of influential women. You mentioned Dr. Shanta
Shanta
Thapalia,
Thapalia, yes.
gave you the internship.
Yeah.
Your sister-in-law's friend, who was also
Yes.
like a sister to you,
She showed up.
really shoved you to go get the job.
Yeah.
You went, and then you had, you listened to this talk by Lynn Freeman, and then that changed your career trajectory. Something that has come up, when I'm talking to other women, is also mentorship or, sponsorship of other women. You also, I think you mentioned, right? Like you've had these role models. You've been able to mentor people, but maybe because you were, the first person or, the pioneer in certain industries, not necessarily having those kind of people around you. But was there any important mentor or role model, male or female, who had a significant role in, impact in your career? I know there are these like 3 big ones, but anyone else?
In terms of, who I am just as a person, it really is, it's my parents more than anything else. My mom and my dad, because they're the ones who gave me like a certain set of values on the basis of which I have made so many decisions in life, and I've kept myself going. My dad's humility, my mom's resilience, these are things that I carry with me all the time that get me through. So they're kind of like the behind the scenes, but constantly present, I guess, mentors who have been there and always encouraging me, very proud of me, obviously biased because I'm their daughter.
Yeah.
But they've always been there. And like you said, there've always been women in my life who have nudged me in the right
what are your thoughts
direction.
on that, right? That it's all like these critical women. We can start from your mother.
Yeah.
But then, everyone else who's helped you and, made you, gotten you here today, right? In their own ways.
Always, yeah. And actually, I realized this after, as I was speaking to you as well, when I went back and thought about, who have been the critical people who have nudged me at different points in time. And again, not just people older and more experienced, but also younger.
Yeah.
And I think that's the other thing. It's really important to value those relationships as well. We can have a tendency to think of those who are, kind of junior to us as maybe, knowing less or being less experienced. But they're sometimes the ones who can lift us up as well. And so I've had that for sure. But in terms of, I think all of these different people at different times, which includes, my parents, my husband, who's been a constant, I guess, for the last 30 years. But my girls are the ones who really inspire me more now than anyone else. I think when you're a parent, and I don't know if you have to be a parent to actually realize that, but when your children come and tell you that they believe in what you do and they're proud of what you do, it really, that's a great source of motivation as well. And just seeing them grow, also in many ways, sort of to be influenced. I can see how they're influenced by what I have chosen to do in my life. I sort of take guidance from them as well. I gain a lot of inspiration from them too.
How can young Nepali lawyers or women working in human rights or in the development space leverage global opportunities, networks to build their careers? Any advice? I mean, it sounds like very cliched. Any advice for them? But how do you think? Because you're someone who's moved and had that career trajectory where you've grown, right? So if someone else is starting anew, is just starting out in this field, what would you say to them? Like, where should they start? And if someone doesn't necessarily just want to work here, but actually build a global career, become a global citizen, as to how should they look at their careers, or what should they be thinking?
Well, I think there are a few things that can really help. And, some of these things I think are pretty widely known and accepted. But, talking to people who are in the field is really important, because understanding the practical side of things is crucial. You might think you want to be in a certain place, but once you really hear about the experience of being there, you may realize, actually, it's not what I thought it was. So maybe there's some other place where I should be looking, and not limit my own range of possibilities, right? So to consider other things. So I think getting to know people who have done the types of things that you want to do, I think is really important. But being very open to the unknown, because, like, for example, I could not have predicted where I would be today, like 30 years ago. I ended up working in a field, like I said, where a body of law didn't even exist. I grew with the field. I ended up taking all of these different types of opportunities, mostly with the intention, often with the intention of learning. I mean, applying what I already knew, but then also with the intention of learning. So being curious, I think, is very important. Being very open to new opportunities, like things that maybe one has not thought about before or one has not considered. I think that is incredibly important. And just being bold, like being very courageous, like not being intimidated by the unknown. I think that is also really important. So these are the things that I would suggest really to people who are starting out. And to not be overwhelmed. It can be overwhelming when you're starting out because you just, again, like when I look back, like I was saying earlier, I was trying to figure out how I could fit in and where I could fit in. I guess patience is also key, right? Recognizing that, it's going to take some time to figure out where you actually want to be or where you could possibly be. But being patient with yourself as well is also really important. So maybe just these are like very simple things. Yeah. But
they worked for you.
Yeah, it worked for me.
Who is someone else I should have on the show?
I would recommend a very dear friend of mine. Her name is Elizabeth Broderick. She was on the working group with me. We were independent experts together. And she is also an incredible woman who has an incredible perspective on gender equality, and her career trajectory is also really interesting. And she's been promoting gender equality by working very closely with men.
Okay.
Which I think is a very interesting approach and an important approach. And I'm sure she'd have a lot to say. Yeah. And she's just a really lovely person.
Looking forward to you connecting me with her after the podcast. Thank you so much, Melissa, for being on the show today. I learned a lot. The last 2 times I've had a chance to speak to you, as well as today. I hope that you enjoyed having this conversation as well. And maybe you got a chance to reflect back on certain things because, like you said, sometimes you're so much in the midst of things, you don't really get to think about it then. But I'm hoping that at least I could add a little value with making you reflect back on all of this. Yeah.
Of course. No, it was a pleasure to speak with you. And yes, it's always, it's nice to be able to look back on one's life. And you also helped me connect a lot of dots. Yeah. So thank you.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. Thank you.
Presented by Vyasa Media Network.